You know what finally made me rethink everything I thought I knew about protecting wood? It wasn't a finish. It wasn't a product. It was a rusted bolt. I was looking at a piece of old ship timber at a maritime museum, and the docent pointed something out that stopped me cold. The iron bolt running through the plank had corroded so badly it had split the wood around it from the inside. The iron was gone, just a crumbling orange stain where solid metal used to be. But the wood itself, the timber that had been sitting in saltwater for over 100 years, with no coating, no sealant, nothing, was still sound. I could have built with it that afternoon. That moment sent me down a path I've been on ever since, studying how traditional shipwrights chose and used wood in the most punishing environment on Earth. And what I found turned a lot of my assumptions upside down. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what those builders knew, which species they trusted, why those species survive where iron fails, and the one fastening method that outperforms metal below the waterline. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll show you a trick shipwrights used when driving wooden fasteners that I've never seen mentioned in a single modern woodworking book. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about today is one of the great paradoxes of material science. In saltwater, the material we think of as permanent, iron, corrodes into nothing. And the material we think of as fragile, wood, can last for generations without a single coat of protection, but only if you pick the right species. That's what the shipwrights understood better than anyone, and it's knowledge worth having, even if you never build a boat. To understand why this matters, you need to understand who these builders were and what was at stake when they made their choices. Traditional shipwrights weren't hobbyists. They weren't experimenting for fun. These were men whose material decisions determined whether a crew of several hundred sailors lived or died at sea. A wrong species in the wrong place meant a hull that rotted from the inside, a keel that split in heavy seas, or planking that got eaten alive by worms in tropical waters. The shipbuilding traditions I've studied most closely come from the British Royal Navy dockyards, the American naval yards of the 1700s and 1800s, and the Caribbean and South American builders who worked with tropical hardwoods that most European shipwrights had never seen. What connects all of them is a philosophy that sounds simple, but runs incredibly deep. You don't protect wood by putting something on it. You protect wood by choosing the right wood in the first place. These builders had no epoxy, no fiberglass sheathing, no modern marine coatings. What they had was centuries of accumulated knowledge about which species belonged where on a vessel and why. They knew which woods could sit in salt water permanently and never rot. They knew which woods the shipworm couldn't stomach. They knew which woods would destroy themselves if you paired them with the wrong fastener. And every bit of that knowledge was earned the hard way, by watching ships survive or watching them fail. That's the foundation everything else rests on. So let me show you the specific species they trusted and exactly why each one works. The first wood every serious shipwright conversation comes back to is live oak, and the story that tells you everything you need to know about it is the story of the USS Constitution. That ship was launched in 1797, and when the British fired on her during the War of 1812, sailors reportedly watched cannonballs bounce off her hull. That's where the nickname Old Ironsides came from. But the hull wasn't iron, it was live oak. Live oak is a southern species, Quercus virginiana, that grows in these sprawling, twisting forms along the coastal regions from Virginia down through Texas. The wood is extraordinarily dense, somewhere around 62 to 65 pounds per cubic foot when dry. To put that in perspective, white oak runs about 47 pounds per cubic foot. Live oak is nearly 40% heavier. But density alone doesn't explain why it survives saltwater. Live oak has an interlocking grain structure that makes it extremely resistant to splitting, and its heartwood is saturated with natural resins and extractives that are toxic to the fungi that cause rot. The grain is so tight and the resin content so high that water simply cannot penetrate deeply enough to create the conditions decay organisms need. The United States government considered this wood so critical to national defense that in 1817, Congress authorized the purchase of live oak timberlands on the Gulf Coast. That was one of the first federal timber reserves in American history, not for conservation in the modern sense, for shipbuilding. They understood that without a reliable supply of live oak, the Navy couldn't build hulls that would last. What amazed me when I first handled a piece of live oak was how it felt. It's heavy like a stone. You hit it with a chisel, and it rings. And the fact that it can sit in salt water for decades without any coating and come out structurally sound tells you everything about what natural resin and tight grain can do. Now, the second species shipwrights relied on is one that seems to break all the rules we were taught about wood and water. That species is elm. Most of us learned that wood and sustained moisture don't mix. And for most species, that's absolutely true. But elm does something strange. When you submerge it completely in water and keep it submerged, it becomes nearly indestructible. Elm was the go-to species for keels in many British-built vessels. It was also used for centuries to make water pipes before cast iron became common. Some of those elm water pipes were dug up in London still intact after 200 years underground, fully saturated but perfectly sound. The key is elm's interlocking grain, which is even more pronounced than live oaks. That grain pattern resists splitting under impact, which is exactly what you need in a keel that's going to hit things. But the real magic is that when elm stays permanently wet, the conditions that cause fungal decay never establish themselves properly. The fungi that break down wood need both moisture and oxygen. Fully submerged elm gets moisture, but very little oxygen, so decay organisms can't get a foothold. Here's the critical rule every shipwright knew. Elm must stay wet. The moment you let it go through a dry and re-wet cycle, it rots faster than almost any other species. That's why it works for keels and underwater pipe, but would be a terrible choice for a deck plank or anything above the waterline. The old builders understood this perfectly. Elm below the water, oak above it. Right species, right location. Quick thing before we move on. Everything I am sharing today comes from years of studying how the old shipwrights built, and I have gathered the best of what I have found into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, 150 pages of real craftsmanship knowledge. Scan the QR code on screen or hit the link in the description if you want to take these lessons off YouTube and into your shop. Now, back to what I learned. The third species is one that most woodworkers in North America have never worked with, but every shipwright who operated in tropical waters knew it by name. That species is greenheart, specifically Demerara greenheart, Chlorocardium rhodioe, native to Guyana in South America. Greenheart is dense, around 64 to 67 pounds per cubic foot. It barely floats when you toss it in water, but what makes it legendary in marine service isn't just the density. It's the natural alkaloids in the wood that are genuinely toxic to the teredo worm, the shipworm that has destroyed more wooden vessels throughout history than any storm or battle ever did. The teredo worm bores into submerged wood and eats it from the inside out. You can pull up a piling that looks perfectly sound on the surface and find the interior completely hollowed out. Shipwrights working in the Caribbean and tropical Pacific lost entire hulls to these organisms. But when they planked with greenheart, the worms wouldn't touch it. The alkaloids in the heartwood make it essentially inedible. Greenheart is still specified today by civil engineers for dock pilings, lock gates, and marine structures in tropical waters. That's not historical trivia. That's a living testament to what the shipwrights figured out centuries ago. The fourth species takes the concept of natural durability to its absolute extreme. Lignum vitae Guaiacum officinale is the densest commercially traded wood in the world. It weighs roughly 75 to 80 pounds per cubic foot. It sinks like a rock. But here's what truly sets it apart. Lignum vitae contains up to a quarter of its weight in natural guaiac resin, a waxy, self-lubricating oil that permeates the entire cell structure of the heartwood. This resin makes the wood not only impervious to water penetration, but actually self-lubricating under friction. Shipwrights discovered that lignum vitae could replace metal in one of the most demanding applications on a vessel, the propeller shaft bearing. A propeller shaft spins thousands of revolutions while submerged in salt water. Bronze bearings corrode. Babbitt metal bearings wear out. But lignum vitae bearings, lubricated by nothing more than the seawater flowing over them and their own natural resin, can run for decades. The USS Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine, used lignum vitae shaft bearings. Some hydroelectric plants still use them today because they outperform synthetic alternatives in wet environments. When I first held a piece of lignum vitae, I understood immediately. It doesn't feel like wood. It feels like something between wood and stone, with an oily surface that almost feels warm. And knowing that this material outperforms engineered metals in saltwater is one of those facts that changes how you think about what wood really is. Now, what ties all four of these species together isn't just that they happen to survive in water. There are specific, measurable properties that explain why they work while other species fail. The first property is extractive content. Every one of these species has heartwood loaded with natural chemicals, resins, oils, alkaloids, tannins that are toxic or repellent to the organisms that cause decay. These extractives aren't coatings applied to the surface. They're part of the wood's cellular structure, deposited as the tree converts sapwood into heartwood over years of growth. The second property is density and tight grain. When wood has a specific gravity above about 0.6, water penetration slows dramatically. The cell walls are thicker, the pore spaces are smaller, and there's simply less room for moisture to move in and establish the conditions fungi need to thrive. The third property, and this one is critical, is the presence of tyloses. Tyloses are bubble-like growths that form inside the pore vessels of certain hardwoods as heartwood develops. White oak has them, red oak does not. That's why white oak holds liquid and red oak leaks like a sieve. In marine species, tyloses physically block water from traveling through the wood's vascular system. And here's something that surprised me. In some marine applications, coatings can actually make things worse. If moisture finds its way behind a coating through an end grain check or a fastener hole, the coating traps it against the wood. Now you've got sustained moisture with no way to dry, which is exactly what decay organisms need. The shipwrights understood that a naturally durable species with no coating can wet and dry freely, and the wood's own chemistry handles the rest. Now, let me show you where iron enters the picture, because this is where the real lesson lives. When iron sits in saltwater, it corrodes. That's not a surprise to anyone. But what most woodworkers don't realize is what happens when an iron fastener corrodes inside a piece of wood. As iron rusts, it expands. Rust occupies roughly 6 to 10 times the volume of the original metal. So an iron bolt sitting inside a timber swells as it corrodes, and that swelling pressure cracks the surrounding wood from the inside out. You end up with what the old shipwrights called iron sickness, black stains bleeding out of every fastener hole, and timber that's splitting apart around bolts that have turned to powder. I've seen this firsthand on historic vessels being restored. You pull out what's left of an iron fastener, and the hole is surrounded by a ring of blackened, spongy wood that crumbles in your hand. The timber 3 inches away is perfectly sound. The iron didn't just fail on its own, it destroyed the wood around it. This is exactly why traditional shipwrights use tree nails below the waterline instead of iron. A tree nail is simply a wooden peg, usually turned or riven from black locust or white oak, typically 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches in diameter depending on the application. The shipwright would bore a hole through the planking and into the frame, drive the tree nail through, and then wedge both ends to lock it in place. What happens next is beautiful in its simplicity. When the hull goes into the water, the tree nail absorbs moisture and swells, just like the surrounding wood. Instead of fighting the wood, it becomes part of it. The joint gets tighter the longer it sits in water. There's no corrosion, no expansion cracking, no black staining, no destruction of the surrounding timber. Just wood meeting wood, swelling together, and locking into a bond that can last for a century or more. The wedging technique matters too. Shipwrights would saw a kerf into each end of the tree nail after driving it, then tap a small wedge into the kerf. The wedge spread the end of the tree nail against the sides of the hole, creating a mechanical lock that couldn't pull out. Some builders oriented the wedge perpendicular to the grain of the plank, so the wedge couldn't split along the same line as the timber. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to assume myself, that shipwright knowledge corrects. The first pattern is reaching for a coating before thinking about the species. Most of us treat wood protection as something you add after the build, but the shipwrights would tell you that if you need a coating to survive, you picked the wrong wood. The species is the protection. The second pattern is trusting metal fasteners in wet environments without thinking about corrosion. I've done this myself with deck screws on outdoor projects, and I've seen the staining and wood damage that comes from it. The old builders knew that below the waterline, wood fasteners outperform metal, not because they're stronger, but because they don't destroy what's around them. The third pattern is ignoring the difference between heartwood and sapwood. Sapwood has almost none of the extractives, resins, or tyloses that make heartwood durable. A plank cut from the sapwood of white oak will rot in marine service, even though heartwood white oak can last for generations. The shipwrights were ruthless about rejecting sapwood for any structural application. The fourth pattern is treating all rot as the same problem. The shipwrights understood that wet rot and dry rot are completely different organisms with different conditions. Elm thrives permanently submerged, but rots in wet, dry cycles. Knowing which failure mode to guard against is the difference between a hull that lasts a century and one that fails in 5 years. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I came across studying old Royal Navy dockyard manuals, and I've never seen it mentioned in any modern woodworking resource. Before driving a tree nail, shipwrights would lightly char the ends over a small fire or with a heated iron. Not a deep burn, just enough to darken and harden the outer surface. The charring does two things. First, it hardens the end grain, so the tree nail seats more cleanly in the hole without mushrooming or splitting as you drive it. Second, the thin layer of carbon is naturally resistant to moisture penetration and fungal attack. It's essentially a microscopic coating of charcoal, right where the fastener is most vulnerable, at the end grain. I tried this on a project where I was pegging a timber frame joint with white oak tree nails. I charred the ends lightly with a propane torch, just 15 to 20 seconds per end, until the surface was dark brown, not black and crumbling. The difference in how cleanly those pegs drove was noticeable immediately, and a year later, the joints are still as tight as the day I drove them. It's a small thing, takes almost no time, but it's the kind of quiet, accumulated wisdom that never makes it into the books. Everything I am sharing today comes from years of studying how the old shipwrights built, and I have gathered the best of what I have found into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, 150 pages of real craftsmanship knowledge. Scan the QR code on screen or hit the link in the description if you want to take these lessons off YouTube and into your shop. The sea is the toughest test any material will ever face. And what the shipwrights proved, over centuries of building and watching and learning, is that the right wood, chosen with care and placed with knowledge, will outlast the metal we think of as permanent. Pick the species to the job, and the sea preserves your wood while it eats the iron. That's not romance. That's engineering. And it's knowledge worth carrying into your shop, no matter what you build.